Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes. And I saw that you recorded, so you got my incredibly late notice when it came to the allowing the recording, I hope. So good afternoon, everyone. I am here to talk about exploring the relationship between cybersecurity and digital exclusion for seniors. So we might be the only presenters of this conference that has focused exclusively on seniors, which is bringing some age to the mix, I guess. The first author is Jesper Holgersson, and also with us today, I think, is Joakim and me, Marcus Nohlberg. And we are from the University of Skövde in Sweden, which no one will probably pronounce correctly, but Skövde works fine also. So today I will talk a little bit about digital exclusion, which is kind of an interesting area. I will talk about our study, the method we use, the results, and the conclusions we have drawn from the materials or the research we have done. To begin with, well, information security, I guess no one would attend this conference if you didn't believe it was important, and you know that it has become more and more important in recent years as we digitize more and more. Perhaps a bit more interesting, though, is the digital divide and digital inclusion. Looking at the definition of digital divide, it is the gap between those who do and those who do not have access to new forms of information technology. And this can be both when it comes to lack of possibilities of access, that is that you don't have enough knowledge or skills to access the digital services or the information technology, but it can also be an absent availability of digital equipment. That is that you don't have access to a computer or a smartphone or a tablet. But in most developed countries, it's in general, we tend to focus on the knowledge and the skills aspect here, because most people in the developed world have a possibility to find access to a computer or a smart device in some way. So we typically talk here about access within knowledge and skills rather than access to physical devices in this topic. And what we see is that seniors, and in our research, we mostly talk about people above the age of 65, which is the typical retirement age in Sweden. And a large part of those are digitally excluded. That is, and it's kind of ironic because they have perhaps a very large need for using digital services, but at the same time, they use them less than other age groups. And in general, they are more skeptical when it comes to this. And this became very evident in the recent years because during COVID-19, when we started to plan for vaccination in Sweden, we started with the oldest age group. I think we started with those over the age of 85. But the assumption was that they should use our national digital bank ID to book vaccination times. And this turned out to be very hard because the majority of those above the age of 85 don't have digital IDs. And in general, what we see in Sweden is that many of the required services that the government have are now only digital, like your taxes. So in Sweden, you cannot submit taxes on paper anymore. You cannot sign on paper. So you need to either send a short message with your phone or use an app or log in to a web page. They don't even accept paper taxes anymore. And this, of course, is tough for those who are elderly and don't know about how to use technology, or they don't have access to it, or they just haven't used it before. So we are seeing in many ways an increasing digital divide, because even though a lot of the elderly and a lot of the seniors are very good at using technology, the requirements on the systems and just how much technology they are going to use is increasing. So in general, what we see from research, seniors are digitally excluded due to an attitude and a lack of interest. That is that many of them, absolutely not every one of them, don't really want to use computers and technology. They think that is unnecessary or it's not something that they find to be convenient. There's also a problem with high age and literacy, and it's because as you get older, it's more difficult to read. Many of the devices are very small. If you have a hard time reading, or if it's difficult with your eyesight, a smartphone is going to be a bit of a hassle to use. And there's also linguistic problems because there's a lot of computer lingo that we who grow up with computers are blessed to be quite familiar with. Those who didn't have a harder time with it. And there's also quite a lot of English use, which is also a problem for especially the older generation in Sweden, which is not that good when it comes to speaking English. And maybe altogether, this might lead to a fear of using technology. And that is something that we wanted to explore. Because if we look at the fear aspect, what is it that they actually fear? What's the thing that keeps them from using this except for, eyesight? We looked into research and we saw that there is a number of fear aspect that has been put up in previous research, and it's fear of pushing the wrong button. And I guess now in this crowd, I guess a bunch of us are the ones who are helping out our somewhat older relatives. We tend to be that. If we are in this field, we tend to be the one at a family dinner. Someone will bring you a device and want you to help them out with the settings, or why doesn't the internet work, or why, help people out. And very often, I mean, in my own experience, people are very afraid of pushing the wrong button, doing something that might hurt something or destroy the device. I don't know how many times I told my mom that there's zero risk of her destroying her iPhone by clicking the wrong button, but that is still a key point. There's also a well-established fear of giving out personal information because they don't really understand what happens. So any kind of submitting personal information online anywhere is scary. We also see that fear leads to low self-efficacy, which is in turn leads to poor cybersecurity. So our argument in the start of this research is that we need to look at digital inclusion and security self-efficacy side by side. That is, we can't really look at why people don't use technology, or why we have a digital, we don't achieve digital inclusion if we ignore studying cybersecurity in general. So that was our background and why we got into the field. So our aim was to explore how fear of using digital technology and services is manifested and perceived among Swedish seniors. Now, it's a key point here that we looked at Swedish seniors. And I mean, I would guess that many of the aspects here are the same between different cultures, but as I mentioned before, for instance, language is a part that makes it a tad harder for many of those who are older in Sweden, and I don't think language is the same problem in an English-speaking country, for instance, or even in a Germanic-speaking country, because it's a wider language group. So as a Swede, it's difficult to surf only in a Swedish-speaking internet, for instance. But in general, we would assume that many of our findings would be similar in other countries, but it's well worth pointing out that this was Swedish seniors only that we studied. And we did this with a survey with more than 1,000 respondents. And it was actually kind of a neat setup, because one of the leading telecom companies in Sweden, Telia, organized and sponsored 6 different workshops in a regional area where they invited, actually by physical post mail, the traditional letters, if I recall correctly, those who were older than 65 to come to these sessions where they could get help on using technology, configuring their devices, ask whatever questions they had. And they sorted these workshops into a bunch of different tables. And at every table, there were one senior with more computer experience, but also, and this is a really cool point, a high school student, a volunteer high school student who could help them out. And as they brought their devices and their questions, we also handed them surveys that they could fill out. Most of the surveys were filled out on site, and some of them were filled out online later on if they missed them when they attended these workshops. So really neat workshops, actually. And the data was gathered through qualitative inquiry, that is free text questions where they could write pretty much what they wanted. In total, we got 1,099 transcripts of these surveys, and we analyzed them. As I said before, we had 6 different workshops, and the service covered quite a wide range of materials, but here we only focus on the questions related to cybersecurity. So there were more questions asked in the survey that's not included in this paper. And our analysis, how we did that, we did the content analysis. That is that we observed repeating themes and categorized them using a coding system. We were 3 involved researchers, just you might have seen on the first slide. So researcher number 1, Jesper, read through and did a general coding of every statement. Then we the 2 other researchers, me and Joakim, read through individually all of this also and coded every statement. Then we had a meeting and we discussed any kind of dissimilarities or places where we coded it differently. We discussed those and then we completed the coding process. This was a lot of work. I mean, a lot of work to go through this because it's a lot of statements. So it seems easy here, but if you ever want to get into qualitative analysis, you have to read through a lot of text. It's much neater to do a statistical survey and click on a link in SPSS, but the results are quite nice. So out of 1,099 statements, 423 of them expressed some kind of fear of digitalization and what the use of digital technology might bring. So it's, I mean, roughly 40% expressed some kind of fear of digitalization. So fear is a very present emotion when it comes to discussing why people use or do not use technology here. And it is kind of obvious or rather clear that a general fear of technology do limit elderly from taking full advantage of digitalization. And therefore, fear is a major contributor to digital wide. Once again, 40% has some kind of fear from using technology that they expressed in our surveys. And what we see is that in general, as I said before, roughly 40% think that computers are something new, and learning something new on your own is both difficult and scary. We had some quotes. And once again, these has been translated from Swedish, so some of the idiomatic expressions might not be super perfect in English. But one of them is that we chicken out from the new things that we don't really understand without help from a woman who is 74 years of age. Because it has not been natural for us to use the computer from childhood, it becomes more frightening. Fear of feeling unknowing, not understanding what they are about to do. Fear of doing something wrong and not taking the consequences of one's actions. A woman who's 86. And lack of contact with the younger generation, a fear of doing wrong or a lack of information from the society. And honestly, reading through the data set we had, it's really obvious that a lot of these people really do want to use technology, but it's very easy for us to forget just how rapidly technology has been developing. I mean, the 86-year-old woman, she retired probably 21 years ago. So basically, we didn't use much computers back when she was working. So in these age groups, many of them has really been excluded. Many of them has managed to work most of their professional life without needing to use computers to any great extent. And it's easy to forget, especially if you, like me, grow up with your own computer, but it is a fairly new phenomena. So our analysis, when we went through the data, we found 4 distinct types of fear that the participants addressed. They have a fear of doing things wrong and the consequences that doing things wrong might bring to the participants. We see a fear of new technology advancements, which acts as an inhibitor towards using digital technology. I'll talk a little bit more about these further on. We also see a fear of being conned or tricked by imposters, as well as being exposed to Trojans and viruses. We see a fear of letting others understand how little the participants know about how to use digital technology and digital services. That is, they actually feel a sense of shame or embarrassment that they don't understand the technology. And this is something that we perhaps way too easily forget, but it's actually a sense of shame that they don't understand and use the technology in the right manner. Well, a table of just how many said what, I'll mention this a little bit further on. So the most common one was fear of doing the wrong thing. There's a lot of different aspects. 12% specifically mentioned this, but it seems to be mostly about the fear of not knowing what to do when using digital technologies, but also not really understanding the possible negative consequences that might be the result of poorly performed actions. That is, if you do something wrong, you don't really understand what happens. You only understand that something negative might happen, but you don't really have enough knowledge to understand the extent of the consequences. So one of the respondents said that you're just afraid of destroying something and you don't dare to test something because you can't overlook the consequences. And as I mentioned earlier, this is something that I meet often in my older relatives. We also see the second category is the fear of new technology, and that is that they might not really fear of doing something wrong, but they do not really understand the new technology, and they don't really understand more specifically where to turn to get help. So they do feel left alone, and they don't really understand it. And just imagine that you might have used a stationary desktop computer in your work, and then you retire, and 10 years later you get an iPad or a tablet to use, and it's just a completely new user interface. It's a completely new way of using the computer, and you don't really know where to start even to ask someone for help. And 7% of the participants expressed a lack of interest and low self-esteem, as well as a lack of knowledge. That is that many of them don't really even have an interest for it because they can't see the benefits of using it, or they have a very low degree of self-esteem, making them not really believe that they can use digital devices. We also see that fears of being conned or subjected to various types of fraud are common. 6%, 65 participants mentioned this. I would honestly have believed that this would have been a higher number, because if you don't really understand the technology, you might be very frightened of someone exposing you to frauds or something. But those who mention it mention having read about fraudsters, viruses, account hijacking, and similar, and this leads to a suspicion and fear of losing accounts or money when using digital technology and the internet. And it's also fear of being conned or tricked by someone is often expressed together with a general fear of perceived lack of knowledge. That is that you might be afraid of being conned, but you also don't really, you're also afraid of even pushing a button or clicking on a link or something because of the possibility of being tricked in some way. And the final category of fears identified was shame. It's not super common, only 2%. There might be perhaps more who feel this, but didn't write it out. And it's they're feeling insecure about asking for help. They don't know who to ask, and they don't want to be over trouble. They feel that it's embarrassing to not know about how to use basic technology. And it's something that they feel embarrassed to admit to others. So a general discussion here. Well, the aim of this research was to explore how fear of using digital technology and services is manifested and perceived among Swedish seniors. We found 4 distinct types of fear that I talked about earlier. And while the types of fear are different, they are very often overlapping. Most of them expresses more than one kind of fear, often in combination with a perceived lack of knowledge. So it seems that the lack of knowledge is kind of a foundation, and that leads to a number of different fears. And it is also rather apparent that not understanding the digital technology do bring on a lot of specific fears, or even having a basic understanding about digital technology. So the main conclusion that we can draw from our research is that fear stemming from a lack of knowledge is indeed an inhibitor to technology adaptation among seniors. That is, that if people are avoiding using technology, I mean, of course, they won't get exposed to threats and frauds or lose data in their devices, but the price that they do get to pay is that they are left out of all of the positive aspects. I mean, in our society in Sweden now, it's tricky to book a time for the doctor's office. It's tricky to get your prescription medicine. It's difficult to order something online. If you don't have a bank ID, it's quite difficult to even be an active citizen, because we are more and more often using bank ID. If I want to buy things at our Swedish sporting goods store, I need bank ID to purchase something there. So if you don't have this kind of basic technology use, you are really left out of the society today. So yes, indeed, you are a bit more secure, but you are definitely losing out on a lot of aspects in society. So what we would argue is that this problem should be addressed with efforts into training seniors to increase their digital self-efficiency. One major competence that should be included when designing training programs for seniors is how to use digital technology and digital services in a safe and secure manner, and not just the basics on how to use it, because fear is very persistent. So it's important to focus also on security and safety for the elderly or the seniors. And given the fears perceived by the participants, the suggestion of training to improve cybersecurity and the possibility for higher awareness stemming from fear and anxiety, we do argue that we need to continue to study digital inclusion and cybersecurity behavior side by side. So we don't really see that this is two separate tracks, because the fear is so persistent and so common that we need to address these simultaneously in the future. And in general, secure digital inclusion do really make for a very promising research domain. And we do suggest that future research should focus not only on how to include seniors in the digital world, but how to do so securely, because it's a massive group of users that are really uncomfortable with using technology. It's roughly 20% of the population in Sweden now, and many of them are very unwilling to use the new technology that's there to help them. So this is a very important area to research, and to where one can really make a large difference. So that's it. Thank you guys for listening. I'm happy to take any questions you have.